Welcome to the moment where your name stayed on the table far longer than anyone expected. Not because you were loud, not because you were obvious, but because after hours of analysis, debate, and replaying every interaction, they still couldn't answer the simplest question. What are you? They talked in circles, not angrily, not dramatically, methodically, carefully, as if the right wording might suddenly make you fit. They reviewed moments, pauses, choices, silences. They pulled apart details that were never meant to stand alone, and the more they examined you, the less coherent the picture became. That's when unease set in, because uncertainty usually shrinks with discussion. Patterns emerge, labels form. Agreement happens, but this time, the opposite occurred. Every conclusion contradicted another. Every interpretation exposed a gap, and instead of clarity, they found themselves staring at something they couldn't compress into language. You didn't do anything new. That's what unsettled them most. You weren't changing masks. You weren't shifting strategies. You weren't escalating or retreating. You were consistent. And consistency is supposed to make people easier to understand, not harder. Yet somehow, the steadier you were, the more fragmented their understanding became. They tried to define you by behavior, too calm. They tried to define you by intent, too quiet. They tried to define you by impact, too disproportionate. Nothing lined up the way it was supposed to. Because they weren't dealing with a role, they were dealing with integration, and integrated people don't present as one thing. They present as coherence across situations. They don't react the same way to every stimulus, but they respond from the same internal center. And that center doesn't broadcast itself, it just governs quietly. That's what they couldn't name. You weren't passive, you weren't aggressive, you weren't strategic in the obvious sense. You weren't accidental either. You were intentional without signaling intention, and that breaks classification. They spent hours trying to decide whether you were moving towards something or simply existing in alignment, whether you were aware of the effect you were having or indifferent to it, whether you were a phase, a variable, or a constant. Every answer felt incomplete because you weren't operating on their axis. You weren't trying to be understood. You weren't trying to be misread. You were just settled, and settled people short-circuit analysis. You could feel none of this urgency from where you stood. While they debated definitions, you stayed present. While they replayed your actions, you remained grounded. While they tried to predict your next move, you weren't preparing one. You were responding to the moment you were actually in. That's the gap they couldn't bridge. They were analyzing you as an object. You were moving as a subject. That difference matters. Objects can be mapped. Subjects choose. Objects are defined by external observation. Subjects are governed internally. And the more internally governed someone is, the less useful external labels become. They tried to figure out if you were aware of how unreadable you were. That question stalled the room, because if you were unaware, then you were instinctive, and instincts that precise can't be managed. And if you were aware, then you were intentional, and intention that quiet can't be pressured. Either way, there was no leverage. You weren't hiding anything. You simply weren't leaking. And leakage is what most people rely on to understand each other. Tone, urgency, emotion, reaction. All the small tells that signal where someone can be influenced. You had fewer of those now. Not because you were guarded, but because you were integrated. You didn't need to externalize processing to stay regulated. So they watched and still couldn't. One person thought you were evolving. Another thought you'd already arrived. Someone suggested you were unpredictable. Someone else said the opposite, that you were the most consistent presence they'd seen in a while. Every statement sounded convincing until the next one contradicted it. They weren't confused about what you did. They were confused about who you were being, and identity that isn't reactive resists naming. You didn't present a character, you presented a state, and states aren't static. They're felt, experienced, responded to, but they're hard to describe without flattening them. That's why the conversation kept looping. They were trying to turn a lived experience into a fixed concept. It wouldn't stick, because you weren't one thing. You were alignment in motion, and alignment doesn't need a label to function. That's why, after hours, the room reached the same uncomfortable conclusion from different angles. We don't know what this person is. Not in a dismissive way, in a disoriented way. The kind that happens when familiar frameworks stop working. You didn't break their rules. You stepped outside the need for them. And now, the more they talk, the clearer it becomes that the question they're asking isn't really about you at all. It's about the limits of their understanding. The longer they talked, the clearer one thing became. They weren't getting closer to an answer. They were circling a boundary they couldn't cross. At first, they thought more time would help, more discussion, more perspectives. Someone even suggested stepping back, letting things cool off, coming back later with fresh eyes. But time didn't simplify you. Distance didn't blur you. If anything, the gaps made your presence more pronounced. Because whatever you are, you don't dilute. They tried reconstructing you from fragments. A pause here, a decision there, a moment where you could have reacted but didn't. They treated these pieces like clues, assuming they would add up to a familiar picture if arranged correctly. But every arrangement felt wrong. Too small, too flat. Like trying to describe depth using only surface measurements. You weren't evasive, you were whole. That distinction frustrated them more than any deliberate ambiguity ever could. People are trained to read effort. They're trained to spot ambition, fear, hunger, resistance. They're comfortable interpreting movement that comes from lack. But your movement wasn't compensatory. It wasn't filling a gap. It wasn't trying to become something else. It came from sufficiency, and sufficiency doesn't broadcast itself. That's why some of them kept asking the same question in different forms. Is this intentional? They wanted to know if you were doing something on purpose, if there was a plan they were missing, if this unreadability was strategic, but intention wasn't the right lens. You weren't strategizing against them. You weren't performing depth. You weren't withholding to create intrigue. You were simply acting from a place that didn't require explanation. And when action doesn't seek validation, observers lose their bearings. That's what they were experiencing. They were used to people negotiating their identity in real time, adjusting tone, clarifying position, responding to feedback. You weren't doing that anymore. Your internal alignment had stabilized enough that you no longer needed the room to help you locate yourself. So they couldn't locate you either. One person finally admitted what others were avoiding. We keep trying to define them by reaction, but there isn't one. That statement landed heavier than expected because it forced everyone to confront the same realization. The usual pressure points didn't apply. You didn't flinch when ignored. You didn't swell when acknowledged. You didn't escalate when misunderstood. Your emotional amplitude was steady. And steadiness is unsettling to systems that rely on spikes to track influence. They started wondering when that shift had happened, when you stopped broadcasting internal movement, when your reactions became measured instead of immediate, when your silence stopped being absence and became containment. They realized it hadn't been sudden. They'd just been slow to notice. That recognition brought a different kind of tension into the room. Not urgency, humility. The uncomfortable awareness that they might be dealing with someone who had already passed through a phase they were still theorizing about. That possibility made conversation quieter, not because they were intimidated, because they were unsure which assumptions were still valid. You weren't competing with anyone. You weren't advancing an obvious agenda. You weren't signaling superiority or submission. You were self-directed, and self-direction can't be engineered easily. They debated whether you were evolving or finished, whether you were in motion or at rest, whether what they were seeing was a transition or a settled state. Every option felt plausible and incomplete, because you weren't one or the other. You were integrated. Integration looks paradoxical from the outside. It's dynamic without being volatile, calm without being passive, responsive without being reactive. People expect clear markers, beginnings, climaxes, conclusions. But integration blurs those lines. It looks like continuity. And continuity is hard to narrate. That's why they kept stumbling over language. Words like phase, strategy, persona kept falling apart. Mid-sentence, none of them fit cleanly because you weren't performing a role. You were inhabiting a state, and states don't announce them. That realization doesn't sit well with people used to mastery through analysis, but it was unavoidable. They weren't failing to understand because they lacked intelligence. They were failing because the model they were using assumed something about you that wasn't true, that you were oriented toward them in the first place. You weren't moving against the room. You weren't moving for the room. You were moving from yourself, and that reframes everything. When someone moves from external reference points, they can be influenced by changing those points. When someone moves from internal alignment, external discussion becomes largely irrelevant to their trajectory. That's the truth they couldn't say out loud, because saying it would mean admitting that the hours of conversation weren't actually about you. They were about their discomfort with not being the reference anymore. So they kept talking, but the tone had changed. Less certainty, more careful phrasing. More pauses. They weren't trying to win the discussion now. They were trying not to misrepresent something they couldn't. And that caution, while subtle, marked a turning point. You were no longer being reduced. You were being respected, even if not understood. That's a rare shift. Respect usually follows understanding. But in this case, understanding refused to arrive, and respect filled the gap. Not admiration, not endorsement, a quieter form, the kind that comes from recognizing complexity without needing to dominate it. They began to agree on one thing: at least whatever you are, you don't require intervention. Not because you're harmless, but because interference would say more about them than about you. That agreement didn't resolve anything. It didn't provide clarity, but it changed the energy in the room. The urgency drained out. The need to decide softened. The pressure to act dissolved into watchfulness. You had become something that couldn't be rushed, and that, more than any label, defined your position. They ended the discussion not with conclusions, but with caution, with an unspoken understanding that trying to pin you down would likely distort whatever they were trying to understand. That leaving space was the only honest response. You didn't ask for that space. You created it by not needing their agreement to exist. And while they left that room with questions still unanswered, one thing had quietly settled beneath all the confusion. You weren't undefined. You were beyond definition in the ways that mattered most. And that realization, unresolved, uncomfortable, undeniable, would follow them long after the conversation ended. And when the discussion finally ran out of momentum, it didn't end with clarity. It ended with quiet limits. No one said it directly, but everyone felt it at the same time. They had reached the edge of what could be understood from the outside. Not because you were hiding anything, not because you were deceptive, but because you were no longer organized around the need to be understood at all. That realization sits differently than confusion. Confusion wants answers. Limits demand humility. They began to sense that whatever language they used next would only flatten you. Reduce something lived into something theoretical. Turn a state into a symbol. And for the first time in that room, people hesitated not because they lacked confidence, but because they didn't want to distort what they couldn't fully grasp. That hesitation mattered. It marked the moment you stopped being treated like a problem to solve and started being treated like a reality to account for. You weren't undefined because you were vague. You were undefined because you were complete. Complete enough that no single interpretation could capture you. Complete enough that different people could experience you differently without any of those experiences being wrong. Complete enough that analysis didn't converge. It branched. That branching unsettled them at first. But then something else happened. They stopped trying to collapse the branches. They accepted multiplicity. Some alone finally said, not as a conclusion, but as a boundary. Maybe this isn't something we're meant to resolve. And instead of resistance, the room went quiet again. Not the earlier tension, filled silence, a calmer one. The kind that arrives when effort is released. That sentence didn't solve anything. It ended the struggle because once you accept that something doesn't need resolution, you stop forcing it into forms that can't hold it. And that's what they did with you. They stopped trying to pin you down to regain control. They stopped chasing a unified definition that would let them move on cleanly. They acknowledged uncertainty. And uncertainty, when it's owned, becomes space. You didn't witness this moment, but you live in its aftermath. You feel it in how interactions soften, how questions become less intrusive, how people give you room instead of probing for explanation. The obsessive need to figure you out fades, not because curiosity disappears, but because curiosity matures. It becomes observant instead of invasive. You're no longer watched to be decoded. You're watched to be understood over time. That's a crucial difference. Understanding over time doesn't rush. It doesn't demand answers. It allows complexity to unfold naturally. And when people shift into that mode with you, the pressure evaporates. You're no longer something they need to solve quickly to feel safe. You're something they can coexist with. You notice how this changes your own internal landscape too. There's a subtle relief in not being pulled into interpretation anymore. Not because you feared being misunderstood, but because you no longer need to manage how you're perceived. You've already let go of that responsibility. That's why their inability to define you never felt threatening. It felt almost inevitable. Like a sign you'd moved past a phase where identity had to be legible to everyone around you. You remember a time when being misunderstood felt dangerous, when not being clearly seen made you want to clarify, explain, correct. But now, misunderstanding doesn't shake you. It just tells you something about where others are in relation to you, and that information doesn't require action. You're not trying to be mysterious. You're not cultivating ambiguity. You're simply not compressing yourself anymore. And compression is what most social understanding depends on. Simplified versions, digestible narratives, clean arcs. You've stepped out of that economy. You move at the speed of integration now, not interpretation. That's why hours of discussion produced no answer. Because you're not a concept, you're a trajectory, and trajectories can't be fully understood from a single snapshot. They require time, they require observation without urgency, they require patience. Some people in that room sensed this instinctively. They stopped asking, "What are you?" and started wondering, "Where are you going?" That question didn't need an immediate answer either, but it felt more honest. Because direction doesn't need definition to exist. You're not drifting, you're moving, just not in a way that announces itself, and that's what ultimately disarmed the obsession. Not silence alone, not restraint alone, but continuity. You didn't break under attention. You didn't swell under curiosity. You didn't shift under analysis. You stayed yourself, and when someone stays themselves consistently across pressure, fascination eventually gives way to respect. Respect not for what can be named, but for what holds together without explanation. That's what you are now, something that holds. People will still talk about you, that doesn't stop, but the tone changes, less frantic, less invasive, more careful, more thoughtful. You become something people reference rather than dissect. Something they factor in rather than try to dominate. They don't know what you are, and they no longer need to, because they know what you aren't. You aren't reactive. You aren't hollow. You aren't unstable. You aren't performative, and that knowledge is enough. You didn't give them answers. You gave them a boundary around what can be understood quickly, a boundary around what requires patience. A boundary around what doesn't bend to group consensus or collective explanation. That boundary protects you, and it also protects them from forcing clarity where none is needed. You continue moving forward unchanged by the hours they spent talking, not indifferent, just unaffected. Their analysis didn't define you. Their confusion didn't limit you. Their obsession didn't pull you off center. You were already centered. That's why they couldn't agree. And that's why, in the end, they stopped trying. Because some things don't need to be solved. They need to be allowed. And you've reached a place where allowance comes naturally, not because others grant it, but because you no longer require permission to be exactly what you are, even if no one can fully explain it. They spent hours talking about you. They still don't know what you are. And the quiet truth is, neither do they need to, because whatever you are, it's already moving forward, intact, integrated, and unconcerned with definition.